historic Grade 2 star list church in Whitechapel, East London. My name is Rick Jones, and I am a member of the committee here which looks after this building. The other members of the committee get cross with me if I don't say Grade 2 star listed building. It's important, apparently. There's no Grade 3, you have Grade 2, and you have Grade 2 star, which is one below Grade 1, obviously. And that's what this amazing place is. It's like stepping into the 18th century, this building, through the doors, off the streets in Whitechapel, and into a building with box pews, German memorials around the walls, and a wheezy organ behind the audience in front of me. Tonight's talk is about the connections across London, north to south, the Thames Tunnels. And our speaker this evening has a lifetime of experience with the creator of some of the tunnels under the River Thames, the Brunel family, Father Mark, son Isambard, because our speaker was a student at Bristol University of aeronautical engineering and lived as a student in the shadow of the Clifton Suspension Bridge, one of Brunel's greatest creations, and then latterly as a financier in the City of London, living next to Rotherhithe Tunnel, which is also created by the Brunels. So there is no better person to talk about the Thames Tunnels than the curator of the Brunel Museum. I give you Khalil Mohammed, who is going to be our speaker this evening. Thank you very much. Over to you, Khalil. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invite, and I'm going to talk about the Thames Tunnels. Now, before we start, I'm going to ask a question. Who's actually heard of the Thames Tunnels? All right, so there's a lot of you. All right, okay. Now, the Brunel Museum is actually in Rotherhithe, and when we do have visitors coming to us, a lot of them can get confused because they think it's the Rotherhithe Tunnel that Isambard and Mark Brunel obviously built. The council, who's responsible for the whole area, hasn't done the museum any favors. Because if you drive towards Rotherhithe Tunnel, outside the tunnel, there's a mass structure which says Brunel written on it. And even though the Thames Tunnel was next to the Rotherhithe Tunnel, it wasn't actually designed and built by the Brunel family. Now, the claim to fame is that the reason why we got the title, the eighth wonder of the world, was because when it first opened during the Victorian era, it was called the eighth wonder of the world, because no one had dug a tunnel underneath a navigable river. Now, before these tunnels were dug, the general accepted principle was what's called cut and cover. What you had to do was cut a trench, build the tunnel, and then cover it up again. But how do you actually do that under a river? Now, unless you're Moses and you split the water off, that's not going to happen. So something novel had to be done. Now, if you look at basically London in the beginning of the 19th century, it was pretty busy. I'm just trying to change the slide. Oh, there we go. This is what London looked like at the beginning of the 19th century. Now, there was up 3,000 ships coming into London to unload the goods and services. It was so busy that it would take on average 3 months to unload. And in those 3 months, goods was often spoiled and with loads of thefts. London did try to fix it. If you look across into Wapping, opposite the river, there was actually, some people have come across Tobacco Dock. That was a bonded warehouse to allow tobacco to be unloaded in relative safety, but that wasn't good enough to cope with the volume of traffic coming in. They actually said they can walk from Greenwich to London Bridge just by stepping on each of the boats without touching water. Okay, and this picture is actually on a quiet day. On some days, there was only 2-3 lanes where traffic would go through upwards towards the river. So something had to be done. Now, this is a picture of London at that time. There was only 2 main crossings. It was London Bridge and Blackfriars. Now, if you look at London Bridge today, it's pretty boring concrete structure. At that time, they had stalls on both sides, they had peddlers, so there's heavy congestion. And the next crossing west was Blackfriars. Tower Bridge hadn't been built. Couldn't build another bridge because the ships had masts. So the only way was sort of underwater. Now, Cornish tin miners came to London before, tried to dig under the river. But Cornish tin miners are used to rock and solid material, not water, mud, sand, which collapses. So they gave up. And it was up to Mark Brunel. Now, a lot of people go, sorry, this picture. You can see how congested it was. So something had to be done. Now, this is Mark Brunel, and Isambard is his middle name. Now, Mark Brunel was actually a world-famous engineer in his own right. Nowadays, everyone remembers Isambard because he did significantly more stuff during the Victorian era. Now, Mark Brunel was a royalist. And during his lifetime, he actually escaped from France because there were people chopping heads off for being a royalist. So he actually escaped to America. And while he was in America, he became the chief engineer of New York City. Then he eventually came back to Britain and he started working for the Admiralty. And he actually was one of the first creators of the production line. So as you can imagine, the Admiralty had loads of ships, and the ships needed wooden blocks to actually hoist the sails up. At that time, it was very expensive to build these wooden blocks because they needed skilled laborers. So Mark Brunel came with an idea of how you can actually use unskilled laborers to make the wooden blocks. And then at the final stage, you have a skilled laborer to actually check the quality and make any adjustments. That saved a huge amount of money for the Navy. He also invented army boots because he realized that the army boots the British were using weren't good enough. And he actually made his fortune doing that as well. So where did Mark Brunel get his idea from? He actually got it from this. It's called a shipworm. And actually, the name shipworm is a bit of a misnomer. It's not actually a worm at all. It's actually a clam. And if you go anywhere in the world, especially during the tropics, these worms are known to sink ships and destroy piers. And what Mark Brunel was doing was that when he spotted this worm operating obviously on wooden ships that the Navy was responsible for, he said, how is that worm getting from one side of the wood to the other side without being crushed? And what this worm was doing, as you can see on top of its head, it's got some bone. And what it was doing was boring through the wood, secreting it back around itself, which will harden and create a shield to stop the tunnel collapsing as it bored through. And as you can imagine, a lot of engineers come with good ideas. Mark Brunel said, I'm going to copy that worm and see what I can do. And he came up with this. This is what we call the shield. Now, the Thames tunnels, even though on the river there's two tunnels, they weren't dug as two tunnels. They were dug as a box tunnel first. And essentially what the shield is essentially a platform where men can dig in relative safety. What happens in each of those sections, depending on how big you want to construct a tunnel, this was 12 by 3. In each of the sections, there's a man with a bucket and a pickaxe. Now, in front of him, from floor to ceiling, is actually planks of wood stacked on top of each other. That's because the material in front of them is very soft. Sand, mud, and soil, it would collapse if there's nothing supporting it. And what each man would do, they would release one top of the plank, dig 1 brick's worth, put it back again to secure it. Then the next plank, another brick's worth, put it back again. And they're all doing this in tandem. Once they've synchronized, the shield moves forward and the bricklayers then built the 2 brick tunnels behind, offering the structural support, exactly what the worm was doing. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Should I go down here? Is that better? Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Brilliant. I'll stand closer to the screen. Yeah. Okay. So then the field moves forward, and the bricklayers then built the 2 tunnels, offering the structural support. Now, if you look at modern tunneling today, we've got a big boring machine, which does its job as the shield, and prefabricated sections of tunnel which clamp together to create the tunnels themselves. But this was the first in the world that goes underneath the river. And that's what it was done. And the shield was actually a patented idea done by Mark Brunel. Can we get to the next slide? So this is what the tunneling idea was. Now, the left-hand side is Rotherhithe, and the right-hand side is Woking. And the plan was to go literally down into the river, then back up again. And the plan was to do this in 3 years. That's what Mark Brunel envisaged. Does anybody guess how long it took? 18 years. It took 18 years. 18 years. So Crossrail being delayed recently. This has been going on for hundreds of years. And And the whole plan was to actually get this all done and have it open to horses and carts, pedestrians, everything, just to make ends meet and money make. So this was obviously the design that it came up with. Now, this wasn't the final design. Now, Mark Brunel, when he came up with the initial design, he had 3 tunnels. And what is quite nice that he watercolored them. And the Brunel Museum was lucky enough, a few years ago, one of the arms of the Brunel family sold off 32 designs, and we actually got them in an auction. So we got them not displayed yet, but we plan to display them at the museum. But it's an iterative process. He wanted to have interconnecting tunnels as well, just for maintenance, but he ended up having just a dual tunnel. That was the final plan. Obviously, if you look at the previous plan, obviously you can see how close the river is. So digging under the river is always going to be problematic. If you ever go to the beach and you put your foot in the sand, you lift your foot up, the side slopes, the water comes in. That's the problem they had here. So using the normal shoring up with wooden platform is not going to work. So what they ended up doing was they created this ingenious thing, which is called the main chamber. But what it really is a giant pastry cutter. So obviously during the pandemic, a lot of people have been baking cakes, so that's what I use the analogy. So what they did was that the bricks weren't actually created there. There was no direct digging. So what they did was they built the cylinder at street level. So it's 50 foot in diameter. They put a metal ring at the bottom. The metal ring on its own weighed 25 tons. They put another metal ring on top, another 25 tons, and they put a steam engine to pump the water out. And the whole contraption weighed 1,000 tons. And they let it sink by gravity. So there's no direct digging. Now, even though Mark Brunel started the project, Isambard took over. Now, Isambard took over incidentally, because there was supposed to be another engineer, but that engineer fell ill. So Isambard took over when he was only 19 years old. And you can imagine what 19 years old are doing today. They're probably updating their socials, not building tunnels in the river. And when Isambard took over, one of the things he noticed was that since there was no direct control of how quickly the shaft sinks, some days it sink by inches, other days it wouldn't sink at all. One instance, it didn't move at all for days. So Brunel instructed the bricklayers, put another 8,000 loose bricks on top. Similarly, you do at home. If you can't get the pastry cutter to cut through the pastry, just give it a bit more oomph. That's what Isambard instructed the bricklayers to do. Nothing happened. He then said, let's go all out. Let's put another 50,000 bricks, loose bricks on top. Let's not mess around. Again, the chamber was steadfast, didn't move at all. So in frustration, Brunel switched off the steam engine and went home. A couple of days later, they came back. Now, what happens if you switch off the steam engine? It no longer pumps the water out. The water stayed in the chamber and actually dissolved the mud, the sediment, the soil, and the chamber started sinking of its own accord. So he came with his own solution. Okay. Now, when the Victorians built that chamber, the issue, and I use the word issue very loosely, it was too perfect. Seems a perfect cylinder. The more of it that went underground, the slower it got. Now, obviously, the Victorians learned by this, and Brunel family learned by this. So the one which they actually put in Wapping, rather than keeping the sides true, they tapered them in by a few degrees. By tapering it in, that means there's less resistance, less friction. This one took 3 months to sink. The one in Wapping only took 2 months. It was a learning process because no one had done anything of this scale before. So it was an iterative process to improve the efficiency. Now, this actually shows the tunneling happening. So once the chamber, actually, if I go one slide back, and once the chamber had been sunk to the ground to the required level, they built the floor. They actually built a reservoir to capture any rainwater and obviously cope with the water table in there. And then they lowered the shield in sections and then started digging through. And they dug in through towards the river. You can see the shield in situ and the bricklayers working. Now, one of the more observant would notice there was no animals used. And the reason why no animals were used is because in the 19th century, the River Thames was the biggest open sewer in the world. Okay, and as people come across the big stink, yeah, so this is when parliamentarians can get their butts in gear and do something quickly. In 18 days, they passed a bill to build a pumping station, process pumping station to get the sewage out, because in the late 19th century, there was so much heat in London, hardly any rain, the riverbed went really low, and the parliamentarians couldn't even work. And there was a plan to actually move Parliament to Hampton Court Palace, but that didn't happen. So you can imagine how working condition was like. The workers themselves did 2-hour shifts. Even the engineers who would go down just to investigate the progress of the work would also fall ill just for like 20 minutes because the fumes were toxic. So no animals would actually survive down there. Okay, so that's why no animals were used. So everything was done by manual labor. So you can imagine how harsh the conditions were. And this shows it another color. This is actually, as I mentioned before, some of the artwork that Brunel painted. This is one of them. And soon we'll have that display because National Lottery has given us money to build a new museum building, and that will be on display for people to see. Now, obviously there was flooding. Okay, now the first flood happened in 1827, 2 years after the building started. Now, one of the bricklayers noticed that while he was working, there was a lot of seepage coming in. And this was a surprise to the engineers, because before they'd started digging, the engineers did some test boreholes across the River Thames. And what they were supposed to get was 15 foot of mud. Now, mud is waterproof. But what they instead got was shingle. And shingle leaks like a sieve. And the instance happened was that this particular flooding, it was almost took Isambard's life. Because Isambard went to investigate to understand why the leak was happening, and the tunnels breached. Water came gushing in, and you can imagine both tunnels being flooded, including the main chamber, full of sewage water. Isambard wasn't able to escape using the normal technique to get out, and the platforms collapsed, and his foot got caught into the scaffolding. But the torrent of water was so severe, it pushed him out. And he got pushed through the tunnels into the main chamber, and he was actually rescued from the original tiny door that led to the main chambers by a worker who was going past. Now, it could have been any of the other workers there, but it was actually Isambard. This sort of body floating at the top. He was dragged out, and he was described as being half alive and half dead. Now, he went to recuperate in Brighton, and then eventually in Bristol, where he got obviously involved in the design of the Clifton Suspension Bridge. Now, it was actually the dredgers. Now, you can imagine, given 3,000 ships are coming to London every day, and the sailors are not going to be very clean, they're just going to throw all the rubbish overboard. Now, the dredgers were supposed to come back once a week, dredge the bottom of the riverbed to allow the bigger burst ships to continue going up the river. But they would cheat. They would essentially say, let's do a big dredge today, and we don't have to come back for a fortnight. But what that meant then was a buffer between the bottom of the riverbed and the top of the tunnels was reduced. And that's where the leak started. So once the Brunel family convinced the port authorities to move the dredges away from where the tunneling was being done, the frequency of the flooding reduced. There were still 5 major floods. And every time there was a flood, they would have to do this there. Now, that is what we call a diving bell. So this is before the invention of scuba equipment. Now, the diving bell is essentially a metal container with benches on the inside. What they would do, they would lower that into the River Thames, and then you have to remember this is the biggest open sewer in the world, so obviously it was horrible work. In Isambard, Brunel did that work himself as well. They would find out where the damage was, where the breach was. They would get sacks full of mud, wicker, shore the damage up, seal it, and you can see here on the right-hand picture, they've actually sealed it full of loads of mud and material. You can see the shield is actually partially collapsed. They would then go under the tunnel, and you can see there's a bit of an air gap there, and they would go by boat. So you could just about get a small little dinghy boat down into that space. They will investigate, then they will actually pump the water out, clean the slurry, let it dry, and then continue the work. So months and months of delays at huge expense. And that's why the tunnels, not surprisingly, took 18 years to finish. And you can see here, this is actually, you see on the left-hand side, this is a better picture of where they've used actually mud sacks to actually support it. And there is actually a guy there on a little boat going in to inspect the damage. There was 5 major floods and smaller leaks in between. Okay. Now, this actually shows one of the plans when basically the tunnels were boarded up because they ran out of money. So there's 7 years where no work was being done at all. They got to about 2/3 of the way and then had to essentially give up. And they had to essentially try to raise more money because the tunneling company was essentially almost bankrupt. And to raise money, they did this. They had a banquet to show to people that the tunnels were safe. So when they ran out of money, they bricked it up, they put a mirror at the back, and then they basically had the Coldstream Guards sing music. They had a silver service, a slap-up dinner, and on the right-hand side, the figure in red is actually the Duke of Wellington. Now, he backed the project because obviously at that time we were going to war with Europe, and he wanted to be able to move troops from one side of the river to the other without any hindrance. A London Bridge and Blackfriars just wasn't up to the job. So he really backed the project. Now, this was enough to raise money as far as the US, but it was the British government that bailed them out because it's of national importance and they wanted the tunnels to be completed. The artist George Jones painted two figures in the foreground. Now, that is artistic license. That's Mark Brunel and his son Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Mark Brunel started the project, Isambard finished it. But the painter wanted to give both father and son credit for basically building the tunnels. Okay, and some of the more observant of you notice that's only one tunnel. The other tunnel was generally made for the workers to celebrate, but that didn't paint because obviously who wants to paint workers when you can have almost royal equivalent of the Duke of Wellington there rather than the unkept Victorian workers. So that was never used. Okay. Then they finally opened in 1843 to massive funfair. It was called the eighth wonder of the world. Victorians came up from all over. Now, they would pay 1 penny to cross. Same cost as London Bridge and Blackfriars, but it was undercover, so people liked it because they never got rained on and they got wind and they never got sleet and snow. And in the first week, they had 50,000 visitors come and see the tunnels themselves. By the 15th week, they had over 1 million. And to put that into context, the population of London in 1843 was 2 million. So half the population came to see them. So it was a massive tourist attraction. And this is what it looked like. So there was actually an entrance on the riverfront. So where we saw the main chamber being sunk in, there was an entrance on the riverfront where the Victorians would come down the stairs and into the tunnel there. This we know is Wapping. And the reason we know it's Wapping is because the staircases are angular. In Rotherhithe, they're actually sweeping, they're like a double helix. And they'll come down, walk down towards the end, onto the other side, and come back again if they wanted to. Now, in between those two arches was 60 interconnecting arches, which were all gaslit. And the tunneling company, in order to make extra income, allowed stall holders to sell their goods and work. And the stall holders, well, obviously, if you've been anywhere in the world, the stall holders are very good at relieving of your cash. The same thing happened here. Now, the reason why they did this was because the Victorian, even though the tunnels have been in existence for a while, the Victorians were a bunch of annoyed people. What they would do, the general public would come down to the tunnels, pay the 1 penny, and do what was called the 400-meter dash. They would run through in case the tunnels collapsed and they drowned. And obviously, if they're doing that, you're not buying stuff from the stall holders. So what the stall holders started doing was they started telling, especially to the men, is that when you go from one side to the other, when you get to the other side, if your hands are full with goods that you just bought, it means you were brave, you weren't scared of the tunnel, and you were perusing all the stalls. And it worked. One enterprising stallholder went one stage further. He actually used to sell handkerchiefs. Now, Queen Victoria came and visited tunnels twice. First time she visited, she was actually just a child. But since it took 18 years to finish, but the second time she came around, it was actually monarch. She was actually the queen. The Brunel family, unfortunately, didn't know she was coming, so they never came in and welcomed her. As she walked through the tunnels, this particular stallholder noticed pools of water on the floor. He then threw down some silk handkerchiefs, so the queen doesn't soil her dress. So you think, oh, that's a nice thing to do. Once the queen has walked past, he picked those up and started selling them as walked over by Queen Victoria. Okay? And not surprisingly, he had endless supply. So very, very dubious ethics for that. And also you notice that it's only at this stage a pedestrian crossing. Okay, there was no animals there at all. And this is also a picture showing basically one of the tunnels with all the interconnecting arches and all the gas lighting there, without the stalls, obviously. And also, they used to have fairs down there. Now, given the fact this was a big tourist attraction, they had to try to keep enticing people to come and visit the tunnels. And they had loads of fairs, they had hung murals, and this is one of the fairs showing how busy it was, how occupied it was with people from one end to the other. This is a visit from Queen Victoria. Coming into the tunnel. That chamber, where you can see the hexagon roof, that no longer exists. This roof doesn't, but the main chamber still exists in Rotherhithe, and the museum is literally the Brunel Museum is right next to that chamber there. Now, this is a recreation of the poster, which was done in this particular one was for 1857, and it shows gestures, fire eaters, trapeze artists, to keep people entertained in the tunnels. Now, at that time, traveling was very expensive. So only the rich and wealthy got to travel. So in the tunnels themselves, they actually had hung murals of paintings. They have the Bay of Naples, Dover Castle, Hampton Court, and basically this is just to show how the gentry lived and what obviously they visit when they go on the grand tour, which a lot of people couldn't do.
It's just like boarding an aircraft to get.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And this was enough to raise extra money for the tunneling. Okay. Now the economics of the tunnels. Now, after a number of years, now the main problem with the tunnels was that they should have been built for commercial traffic, and that never happened. Because the main mode of transport at that time was horses and cars. Now, how do you get horses and cars from street level down to the tunnels? You need a ramp. And the tunneling company just didn't buy enough land. And they couldn't build the ramp system. Now, the ramps have to be gradual as well. That means even more land needed because the horses would be heavily laden. It would be easy for them to get down, but pulling back up on the other side would be very, very difficult. In actual fact, in Rotherhithe, we're quite lucky where basically the chamber there was more space around our chamber. The Rotherhithe station is further away and the chamber is vacant for visitors and events. In Wapping, the station is actually in its chamber. So if you walk down to Wapping station, you'll see where the chamber is. It's all covered in white Victorian tiles. And in Wapping, you can also see the M shape, which you can't see in Rotherhithe because it's underneath the chamber itself. And this is again artistic license. On the right-hand tunnel, you can see horses and carts. That never happened. Now, the second mistake the tunneling company made was that towards the end of the evening, people would pay the 1 penny, go into the tunnels, but not come out the other side because they were homeless and they slept overnight in the tunnels. And the tunneling company did nothing to stop it. Now, the problem with that is that who then wants to go shopping in an arcade where homeless people have been sleeping overnight? So people stopped coming. The stall holders started then losing business. They eventually then left. And the tunnels became derelict. They became crime-ridden. So something had to be done. So in 1865, the East London Tunneling Company sold the tunnels off to the East London Railway Company. Now, in today's money, it cost 70 million to build. They only sold it for 28 million because they just want to get rid of them. They didn't want to be responsible. And then 4 years later, in 1869, the first trains started running through, and they were steam trains. Now, the tunnel was so well built, they were 11 meters wide, 6 meters tall. The only thing they had to do was reduce the size of the funnel. And by that stage, the elaborate ceiling had gone in Rotherhithe, which is probably a good thing because for steam trains, you need somewhere for the moisture, soot, and everything else to dissipate, the pressure to equalize as the trains went one side to the other. And then the tunnels got closed again in the beginning of the 20th century because steam was no longer the main mode of power. It became electric. And then they got closed again because if you're a Londoner, you might have remembered that there used to be a very small line called the East London line, which is orange. The tunnels were closed again to allow the East London line to be integrated into the overground network. Now, TfL nicely opened the tunnels up to the public viewing, which for decades never happened. And the original plan was to open them for 2 weeks. But the demand was so high that they ended up opening for 2 months. The museum was open morning, noon, and night to walk through from tunnels all the way to the other side and back again. Unfortunately, now they're closed because obviously it's got the overground trains running through it. Okay. And this is what it looks like now. So this is in Wapping. So you can still see the M shape. If you do want to see the M shape, you get off the platform, look back where the train coming from. Please make sure you don't get hit by another train. And you'll see that lovely M shape in there. Now, before TfL opened it for the overground network, they did some archaeology. Because one thing they were worried about was ruining or destroying something which was on the tunnels. Now, as I mentioned before, they thought there was painted murals, was mentioned a few times in newspapers. And TfL was concerned that some of those would get ruined before they tanked the whole of the inside of the tunnels. When they did an investigation, they only found essentially white lime wash and lime mortar. Because obviously being hung murals, that was more apt for the underwater because the walls were always damp. So you couldn't really paint on it. And those obviously hung murals have now disappeared. Okay, now this what shows what the site looked like. The 1840s, you can see the chamber on the right, on the left-hand photo, you can see the chamber, and you can see the engine house where the main engine was to pump the water out after the shaft had been finished off. In the 1960s, it was a car scrapyard because TfL, amazingly, were interested in the chamber rather than the engine house. And what is remarkable, if you look at the 1980s, that shows actually a picture of Mark Brunel on the main shaft chamber. Now, this is a very strange setting because the whole site is owned by TfL. The building on the left is the engine house. Now, that is 1842 because the two previous buildings were wooden and they obviously don't last as long as stone and brick. So that is the third building on site. The chamber is 1825. So the chamber is younger than the engine house. So does anybody want to guess which one is more protected? Which is more protected?
Oh.
Yes, the younger one. The reason being was in the 1960s and 70s, there was other buildings, there was a Brunel workshop which got demolished. Now, TfL wasn't interested in the engine house, so they let it go to ruin. You can see there's a chimney missing. We do have a chimney now on the engine house, but it's from 1993. The roof had collapsed and the whole engine house was going to be demolished. So in order to protect it, English Heritage got involved. The engine house now is what we call the scheduled monument, which is the same as Stonehenge. While the chamber is only grade 2. In the UK, we have London, grade 2 star, which is this church, and then grade 2 is what the rest of them is. So that is only grade 2. So it's a bit of a strange one where the younger one is more connected to the older one. So every time we want to drill a hole in the engine house, we have to get permission. And English Heritage will always say, no, do something else. Okay, that sort of ends the talk. Does anybody have any questions regarding the tunneling and the Brunel family?
We've got a roving microphone.
Oh, yes.
Brunel family and Bassett who built the sewers, both ancestry. Was that because the education was better there and we were just doing tactics?
I think that's partly true because I think Isambard was sent to France to get his initial education as well. So he was there for a number of years before he came back to Britain to actually put into practice his old, obviously, what he learned is in the engineering world. So I think that was definitely true. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, not specifically a question, but a comment.
Okay.
After visiting your museum, you went to actually Wapping the other day, and it is true. If you go to the southern end of the platform and you lean over, you can actually see into the tunnel. But the most interesting thing is that if you go into the station and use the stairs and not the lift, you're actually going down the same route of the stairs as you had in your picture.
Yes.
And you can actually see yourself going down the shaft.
Yes, yes, yeah, exactly. So if you visit the as you visit the Brunel Museum and the chamber, you'll see the marks on the wall where the stairs used to be. And you can see obviously the spirals coming down, disappearing into the floor, because then there's a fake floor, which is where the trains run underneath your feet. So you do see that as well, which you can't see in Wapping because it's all been, obviously it's got all the white Victorian tiles and it's all covered up. And also in the chamber in Rotherhithe, you've actually got the soot, which amazingly is listed. So when we did some improvements to the chamber, everything had to be done on the floor. So all the electrics, the heating, the lighting, we couldn't touch the soot on the walls. And actually, a couple of months ago, there was American tourists visiting, and I did my tour, which is obviously more sort of apt when you're in the chamber itself, because it echoes and it's quite, voluminous. And then after I finished, I was talking to another visitor, and I looked across, and this tourist was tapping the walls like this, and I had to come out and say, "Please don't do this." But it's very, very dusty. It's amazing how some parts of the chamber, you can see the original brickwork, the lime mortar and the lime wash is completely coming off, but there's no way of sort of preserving it at all.
If you could go back to these slides you said about the economics of the tunnel.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're looking at the ends of the two tunnels there.
Yes.
This arch that we're looking through, that presumably, what is
Oh,
that? I can understand
That-
the chamber is circular. So what is that arch?
That is okay. Sorry. So the question was that on this picture here, what is the arch which is actually in the foreground? That was the question? Yeah, that is artistic license. Okay, a lot of the Victorians are horses and carts. That's artistic license. So they use a lot. There was a lot of romanticism. in the whole design. And if you look at it from this angle, it looks like the chamber is quite big, but it wasn't. It wasn't. And there's only natural light from the skylight. So there was actually a hexagonal roof with a skylight top, which gave natural light flooded in. But that obviously isn't there anymore. And even the alcoves, which are right at the back there, sort of very iconic, are not there anymore either. Okay, and the ceiling now is actually very, very modern. And when I mean very, very modern, World War II. So during the war, the chamber was vacant because obviously prior to having electrified the network, there were steam trains running through. In order to stop the network from being destroyed by enemy bombs, they essentially put massive concrete blocks and basically steel reinforcements to stop bombs destroying it. And what is quite nice is above that chamber now is a community garden and a cocktail bar. So Midnight Apothecary runs during the summer months, and the lady who runs it, 80% of the botanicals are used to make the syrups of the cocktails. So you should definitely pay a visit. It looks very nice now because we've got vines growing around the edge, all the plants are in full bloom, and all the lights are on at night time, so it looks really good. Yeah.
I was a resident of Oberheim in the 1980s. I can remember the icicles and the water dripping down from the tunnel. Does still do that even today. But I've tried to visit the old museum, so the top instant years and failed in literacy.
So the opening hours are normally they open Saturdays, Sundays, and Mondays. Pre-pandemic, it was 7 days a week. Post-pandemic has changed. Over the next couple of months, we're not opening on Saturdays because we have weddings there. So there's a wedding license, and also we have concerts and events in the main chamber now as well. But the museum is open normally on Sunday. I'll be there this Sunday doing my normal volunteering tour guiding, so it's definitely open on Sunday and Mondays as well now. Okay. And I'm sorry you haven't been able to visit when it's been when it's closed. Luckily, we don't have the icicles anymore. But what is amazing is that the original pipework, which the Victorians built when the tunnels were being sunk, in the museum. Those are nearly 180 years old. And what it was done was that, unfortunately, I don't have a picture, but when the chamber was being sunk and the steam engine was above, those two pipes were used to pump the water out. Once you got to the required depth, they then built the floor, all of the inside had to be excavated. And what they did was then move the steam engine into what is now called the engine house to pump the water out. And one of the solitary pipe on its own has basically a 90-degree elbow. And what is quite remarkable is that TfL still use that today to pump the water out. So you can see how well the Victorians built it. And it's also quite funny, if you do go to the museum, you'll see there's some rust marks on the floor because it does leak. And TfL won't touch it because we tell them that it's leaking, and it's like a massive Pandora's box. We start trying to fix it in one way, it doesn't. We've got a solution though. We wrap a towel and a bucket, and then the rust fixes it, and he has done for the last 2 years, so he hasn't leaked. So we're quite grateful that he hasn't leaked again. I didn't have a question yet? No, sorry.
Thank you. I had a question about the thinking chat technology. Did they take up that idea? Was it replicated somewhere else in the world?
Yeah. So the shield. Sorry. Oh, okay. So the question was that whether the sinking shaft was patented or whether it repeated anywhere in the world. Now, the shield itself that was used to construct the main tunnels was patented, but the chamber wasn't, because it's not really patentable because it's just a cylinder sinking into the ground. And there's nothing unique about it. But they, in previous times, people have done it on a much smaller scale. This was the large scale, which no one's invented it before. And that's why there was a lot of learning going on. And then everything else came after that. And it's remarkable because obviously the technology has changed and they made it much quicker to sink. The shield was changed numerous amount of times to make it safer and to stop the water from coming in as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, by the way. So 5 major floods, and it took 18 years. Was there a time that they almost gave up?
Well, the question was that, 18 years, 5 major floods, was there any time that they tried to give up? Numerous amount of times. Because in the newspaper, similar to today, there was, essentially a national scandal. They called it the Great Bore, because nothing was being dug. It was basically laid empty and vacant for so long, and everyone thought that it's not going to get finished at all. And now Isambard Kingdom Brunel was a big follower of saying it shouldn't just be based on the finances. There shouldn't be just bean counters. You're supposed to advance technology, and it might not be perfect, but it's a learning process. And obviously the British government believed them, because that's why they bailed them out to continue the work, because they knew this was nationally important. And look how important it was, because without this, we would not have any modern tunneling. The underground wouldn't exist. The Eurotunnel wouldn't exist. Nothing would exist without this technology first. Okay. Is there any more questions? Yeah.
Just wonder if you know much about the actual workers, whether they were just locals or whether they were people with experience actually now building or something like that. Or
Okay. Yeah, so I'm just going to repeat the question. Yeah, so the question was, do we know anything about the workers, whether they were local or whether they were far further afield? Now, about 6 months ago, we had the U3A, the University of Third Age, do some research behind the workers. And there's actually, the records were never kept in detail because they were, for a better word, expendable. But we did find that there was quite a lot of locals who lived around the area who did the work, but there was loads of Irish people came in, there was loads of immigration coming in from all over the world, because the Docklands at that time was a mismatch of different nationalities. Now, if you look at that particular area, Surrey Keys, Russia's got a Norwegian church, a Swedish church, so there's a whole mixture of people coming in, but they never kept exact records of who was actually doing the work. But it was untrained labor, and even the bricklayers themselves, so obviously sitting in front of a shield and in front of the planks of wood and just chipping away isn't a skilled job. But the bricklayer was more skilled, but the bricklayers were paid on how many bricks they laid per day. So you can imagine the quality of work wasn't brilliant, but then the lime washed it to hide everything away. It's like when it snows in the UK, it covers all the issues up and it looks very nice and nice. That's what happened in the tunnels. Yeah, of course, yeah. And that caused collapses to happen. So having a rounder structure type, which was the next iteration, they actually used that for the Rotherhithe Tunnel. So the Rotherhithe Tunnel, which was obviously 1904, they actually changed the shield's design to actually make it much safer. Yeah. Which you meant? Oh, you meant this one? This one, yeah. So this obviously is big. Sorry, the question was obviously to see whether the tunnel was finished in state. Are you talking about this one, or are you talking about some of the other one? Oh, with the flood. Yeah, because what they were doing was that this wasn't quite finished, but what they were doing was that because the bricklayers could only work to the speed of the shield moving forward. So when they were doing that, they would actually plaster with lime mortar and lime wash the tunnel as it went through, because they were doing nothing else. So we'd have to wait, and if there's any flood or leak happening, then they can't plaster at all because it would just fall off. So they'd have to wait for everything to be sealed. So they were essentially just using the workforce to continue working on the tunnel when they needed to. No, it is like that. It is like that. Yeah, exactly. So if you actually go into the tunnels now, a lot of it's actually tanked with grey, but I think there's about 20 or 30 meters which TfL has kept the original white. And every now and again, on special occasions, they light the tunnels up. As the train goes through, they'll light the tunnels up so people can actually see. So if you actually go on the trains itself, you don't see anything, it's pitch black. But every now and again, they do light it on special occasions so people can see it. And there is that section there. Yeah.
I think she was asking. I think this lady was asking about a buttress in the vault. Is that an original feature?
Yes. So all that still exists, but it's obviously at different levels of disrepair. But there were a few. I think about last year, we did have a contractor with TfL come to the museum, and he was actually tasked to walk to a visual inspection of the tunnels supposed to send me a video, but hasn't done so. Maybe it's under data protection or something, you can't. But he was doing a visiting inspection to see, but all those stuff still exists and in the tunnels themselves, yeah. And if you ever go through the tunnels, as you saw from other pictures, there's actually a gradient. And a TfL driver visits the museum, and he actually says that as he goes in, he has to apply the brakes, which is the speed limit. And then he has to then power out of it. But it's really weird. When you're actually on the train itself, you don't actually feel the gradient. It looks like it's all flat. So it's very, very gradual. And the tunnels are only 400 meters long. So it's not surprising they would. Okay, far away.
And in regards to Rotherhithe, because that obviously is a road tunnel, goes elsewhere. Do you know when that was built and how far away is it from this?
So the Rotherhithe tunnel is 1904 to 1908. So obviously they learned from their mistakes because it only took 4 years to build. And they needed another crossing, and it's right next to the Thames Tunnels. It's literally probably, I would say, less than 500 meters away. So if you look at where Rotherhithe station is, and it's literally on a road which is actually leads straight to the Rotherhithe tunnel. And that's where the Brunel sign is, which has got nothing to do with Brunel. So it's a bit of an oddity.
They built the Rotherhithe tunnel with a long ramp, didn't they?
Yes. So it goes from street level, it sinks down, but it's obviously made for 1904, it was horses and carts.
Yeah.
So horses and carts would go down. And I'm not sure whether it's true now, but someone, I don't know, this is obviously could be like a, an urban myth, but they say that the Rotherhithe tunnel has 2 kinks at it, which it does. And the reason why they say that is because obviously horses and carts, when horses go into darkness and they see a light, they bolt towards the light. And they put 2 kinks in it that the horses go down without obviously seeing the end of the light. So they can literally trundle away. And by the time they get to the end of the tunnel, they turn, there's light, and it's not that far away to get to the end. Oh, you're very brave. We have tourists coming in, and I tell them walk across Tower Bridge. Don't walk across London Bridge. Oh, sorry, don't go into the Rotherhithe tunnel. Does anybody want to guess how many people died during the construction of the tunnels? Now, this was obviously 18 years when the work started. 7 years no work was done, so it was 11 years of construction. This was during the Victorian era, with obviously sewage leaking in, etc. How many people do you think died? None? 5? 500? 2,000? This is like an auction. I don't know what I'm selling. Any more guesses? 10 a year. Okay. In actual fact, it's between 6 and 12. That's it. So very low number. And the reason why we give a range is because it depends on how you count the deaths. As you can imagine, this was the Victorian era, so water was pretty polluted. So a lot of the workers took their liquid intake through beer. And there's one worker who was actually on duty, came in the evening, went onto the site, fell over, hit his head and died. So he's included. So, but there was actually, it's remarkable that this engineering technology, which was brand new, so few people died. But we don't know how many people died due to the illnesses from the river. Given the fact that it was open sewer, we had scarlet fever, diphtheria, typhoid, all these horrible diseases. So we don't know how many people died after the fact, after they worked at the tunnels themselves. But it's very, very low. But then when they built the Rotherhithe tunnel, years later, the number of deaths was 0. Because they learned how to obviously do the technology and how to obviously cover the leaks and the stuff like that. And the shield was really.
So 6 to 12. That's a bit vague. More exactly.
Yeah, because it depends on how you count them. If you say there's all incidental deaths, then you would say, okay, fine, that's counted. And then you would say there's 12. But if you say 6 is real deaths, because 5 died actually during the major flood in 1827 when Isambard nearly drowned himself. 5 died of deaths in one go.
Yeah.
And all the rest were literally drip fed in. And it just depends on.
Thank you for the talk. I just wonder, are there any interesting foreigners' reaction to this project? For example, I don't know, some famous visitors or European royalties or someone of exotic nature. To
be honest, there's no record of it. The only royalty that we know came to visit was Queen Victoria. And that was during the first opening seasons of the tunnel itself. We don't know whether people from Europe came to see them. Obviously, a lot of engineers were interested in the design and how it was actually done, because they wanted to obviously mimic it in their countries, and that's what happened. Because everything else after that was after this. Greenwich Foot Tunnel was done after that as well. But it wasn't like, I don't think there was enough royalty or famous people to come and see it. But there's no records of it. There wasn't a guest book that people could sign. But I'm sure there's we've got a project on the way now where a lot of people are doing the historic research from the newspapers to see whether there is any additional information on who came to visit the tunnels themselves.
Quick second question is, if we want to see today, what are the website or organization we should follow? Do we have to check how to visit Thames Tunnels?
No, just look at the Brunel Museum.
Just look at
which is different to the one in Bristol. Is called Being Brunel, which has the SS Great Britain, which is a ship that Brunel built. But the Brunel Museum is the brunelmuseum.com, and you can look at that. And up there, you can also see we've actually got a milling stone from the SS Great Eastern. People know the SS Great Eastern? Yeah. So this was a ship which Brunel built and designed on the River Thames. And you could actually see the original site because it's still got the railway sleepers which disappeared into the water. Now, the ship was so long that they could only launch it sideways. And the reason why it was built was Brunel was tasked with getting a ship that can go from England to Australia and back again without refueling. And while it was being built, they discovered coal in Australia. So they didn't have to do it. But they built the ship. He was the first one to come up with the design of bulkheads, putting different compartments in the ship. So he was the first one to do that. And even the propellers he designed, using modern technology now, they can only improve the efficiency by 15%, 1.5. It was that well built. And everyone must have seen the famous picture with Brunel with the chains behind, stove at cigar. That was done at the SS Great Eastern, opposite the river in Masters.
Is that Isle of Dog?
Yes. I don't know. You can actually, if you go on the Clipper boats, it's a request stop. So if you tell the steward or the captain that you want to stop at Masters, they will stop for you. But normally they go all the way to Greenwich without stopping there.
Thank you very much, Khalil. You brought with you this evening a poster in German, because which was very good of you, this being the German church. But how did that come about? A German poster about the Thames Tunnels?
Yeah, well, the Thames Tunnels, when it first opened, was essentially a big tourist site. So people would come over, and like modern day, sites now, you got, Chessington World Adventures, Alton Towers, they produce loads of memorabilia. So if you go to the Brunel Museum now, you'll see some expensive items, which are like horn beakers made of animal bone, but then you got hip flasks, which are made in the tens of thousands, which everyone wanted a hip flask to carry around with them. Anything the Thames Tunnel could put a stamp on it, they would produce. Thimbles, needle cases, matchboxes. We got snuff boxes. We got boxes for cheroots, which are small cigars. And they produce loads of posters. So they produce posters in different languages, in French, in German. So people can actually, if they do visit, can take it home with them and say, look, that's what we visited. And there is a copy. Rick, where's the copy? Is in the. No.
Yeah, it's in the Matzold Zimmer, where we're going now.
Yes.
For a glass of wine. So thank you very much, Khalil, for this talk on what was a very boring subject. Someone had to get the joke in, I suppose, at some point. You have made it an extremely interesting talk, and it's fascinating, this history that you presented us with this evening. So thank you very much. And I mentioned that the audience here is now invited, and Khalil, to the back of the church for a glass of wine, some refreshment. And the poster that Khalil brought along in German about the Thames Tunnel is, you can view that there. Before we give Khalil a round of applause, I'll just say that coincidentally, the congregation of this church, the committee, received an invitation a few months ago to go to an equivalent ancient chapel, historic chapel, to this one at Kensal Green Cemetery. And Kensal Green Cemetery is where Mark Brunel, his wife, and Isambard Brunel are buried. So it's a great opportunity to follow up this talk on Brunel with a visit to where they're buried. And not only Brunel buried at Kensal Green Cemetery, but a large number of literary people. Anthony Trollope, G.M. Trevelyan are buried there. A list, I can't remember now exactly who's on it. The Duke of Sussex as well, but not the current one, of course. The son of King George III, one of his cemetery, which is what they've been researching on our behalf to show the congregation here at those burials. The Duke of Sussex apparently had fallen out with his family and refused to be buried at Windsor Castle. Kensal Green was where he preferred to be. That was his choice of resting place. I'll also just mention that, as I said at the start of the talk, these are monthly, and in June we have Frank Patterson, who is a much loved spirit on he's given several talks, and on Tuesday the 20th of June he is giving his talk on Nuremberg. Can I remember what he said? Four nouns. Glory, destruction, retribution, and rebirth, something like that. But the history of Nuremberg in Germany, which of course is of great relevance to the history of this building. So please come along to that. It promises to be an extremely interesting evening. That's all the notices I have for now. Thank you all very much for coming, and let us give Khalil now a round of applause for that splendid. Thank you. So thank you all again. Please join us for a drink at the back of the church here now. Of course, that's not open to people line. They'll have to find